So I actually wanted to go back to my hotel room to record this video, but this topic and the message is too urgent, so I thought I'd just step out of the conference that I'm attending here in Cape Town to do this quick video. The President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has signed the Expropriation bill in an attempt to make it a law in South Africa. Now, as you probably know, in South Africa there has been this raging debate about expropriation without compensation for a few years now, but especially since 2018, when the government took a decision that they want to change the South African constitution to empower the state to expropriate or confiscate, we could just as well say, private property without compensation. In other words, taking people's stuff without giving them anything in return. And so this process, a long process has been followed in this regard, and the entire idea has been discredited to such an extent that it doesn't really make sense for them to carry on, amongst others due to the fact that all the available evidence indicates that it's not going to work. But also, other than that, during the public consultation process, it was very clear that the vast majority of people don't want this. Firstly, because people who participated in this process said that they think it would be a very bad, destructive idea. But also because there were a lot of research done within South Africa, including opinion surveys and so forth, which has found that, for example, the amount of people in South Africa who think that land reform is the most important thing that ought to be done to fix South Africa is about 1%. Now, there's much more that can be said about why this is such a destructive idea. And I will say more about this in the future, but I think it's very important to get the message out now that the President of South Africa is trying to implement this, and the ruling ANC is trying to implement this, despite the fact that they have lost dramatic support in the last election, falling to 40% support, and despite the fact that there is a government of national unity in South Africa. So as a result of their loss of support, the ANC managed to stay in power by forming a coalition government with several opposition parties, probably all of which are vehemently opposed to this idea. And so a lot of people sighed a sigh of relief when this government of national unity was implemented, because they thought that the ANC would now be kept in check, and also that more radical parties such as the EFF and Jacob Zuma's MK was kept out by this coalition. But what's effectively happening now is that the president and the ruling party is more radical than they were. They have become more radicalized. Since the government of national unity was implemented, they passed the Bella Bill, which is an attempt not to fix the education system, but to target Afrikaans schools by taking away the power that school governing bodies have and giving that power to the government. And now they want to pass the Expropriation Bill, which would give the government the power to expropriate private property without compensation, or to take people's stuff. And so the question that we need to answer is, what's the point of having a government of national unity if it's a more radical, more aggressive government than the one we had when it was only the ANC? Now, surely the argument is that we need to make sure that parties like the EFF, which is also falling apart, and MK are kept out of power, and therefore we need these opposition parties. We need the DA and the Freedom Front and so forth to be part of government to make sure that it's a more responsible government. But the worst possible outcome that we can have is to have a coalition government that acts as a rubber stamp for a more radical, more aggressive ANC. And that does seem to be the case at the moment. Now, I recently spoke yesterday, actually. In fact, I had an interview with Helen Ziller, the federal chairperson of the DA, which will be published on our podcast soon, on the Pioneer podcast. And she also spoke about this nuclear option. The nuclear option being a point where opposition parties, such as the DA, decide that they need to step out of the government of national unity. And I don't want to speak on her behalf, so you can watch that interview when it comes out. And I think that's a very important factor to consider, because stepping out could mean that other parties might be able to fill the void. But the question that we still have is, what's the point then of being in the government of national unity to keep the more radical parties out if these more radical ideas are being implemented under your watch? which means that the government of national unity would lose its credibility, it would lose its support, people would lose hope for this, and people would start to experience and view this as the problem, not the solution. And if these parties remain in this government of national unity and define themselves or position themselves as part of the problem, as a rubber stamp for implementing these destructive, racist, very dangerous, communist in many ways, policy ideas, then people would not view them as part of the solution anymore, but as part of the problem. And so this is a real serious thing that they would need to consider. And so the process forward now is that the DA Minister, Dean McPherson, has to sign this bill before it can become law. And this would be the biggest test that the government of national unity has had to endure since it was established. And our concern here is that acts like the Bella Bill, which is the Bella Act now, was defined or depicted by these opposition parties as a red line, as a line that cannot be crossed. It has been crossed and nothing has happened. And also expropriation without compensation has been defined as a line that cannot be crossed. And they are now crossing that line as well. So what's the point of being in a coalition repeatedly saying that there are red lines that cannot be crossed, only to see these lines being crossed and not doing anything about this? This is the biggest test that this government of national unity has had. And I think the parties who have been voted for by people who want to ensure that legislation such as the Bella Act and legislation or policy ideas such as expropriation of private property without compensation be kept out. People who wanted to ensure that this is kept out by voting for these parties who are now part of this government who is currently implementing these policy ideas need some feedback. We need to get feedback. We need to understand why is this happening and what are these opposition parties going to do in response to this.